Well, welcome to our first Hangout on our book on the Historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier. And today is October 25th, and we're beginning the book, starting with the preface and going through Chapter 3, hopefully. Or maybe we'll have to extend it for our next few Hangouts, but this is where we're going to begin. So, usually we begin with an overview, general thoughts about the book so far. Does anybody want to lead off?
Well, I guess we should probably explain what the book purports to be. The book is the second volume in basically a set of two, which is kind of weird because it's two different publishers. But it's volume 2 of a work in which volume 1 specifically suggested a methodology to use in New Testament studies / biblical criticism. The second book applies the methodology which he suggested in the first book, specifically onto the problem of the historicity of Jesus. And beyond that, the methodology itself revolves around and involves the central motif of Bayes' theorem as the organizing principle, you might say, of his whole argument. And Bayes' theorem is a statistical tool whereby we we try to calculate the probabilities of things that are conditional on other things. So given whatever evidence we have, our probabilities change accordingly. Something like that.
Yeah, okay.
That's very good.
Yeah. One thing I'll mention about proving history is it's not just about essentially we should apply Bayes' theorem to biblical history. He's using that as the subject matter for his examples, and it is part 1 of 2 parts on a book talking about the historicity of Jesus, basically. But proving history is a more general purpose book on methodology in general, spanning a lot of different fields. I mean, Bayes' theorem is not limited to use in just history. In fact, part of his argument is that in any human reasoning where we have uncertainty, all valid reasoning has to be consistent with Bayes' theorem. If it's not consistent with Bayes' theorem, then it's not valid. It doesn't matter what field you're working in, whether you're looking at exoplanets or something and trying to decide if they have life or something. Your reasoning has to be consistent with Bayes' theorem in order to be valid.
And one of the points of proving history was that because Bayes' theorem had not been applied to historical questions, he also had to kind of lay the foundation for the validity of applying Bayes' theorem to such questions as the answers in that book and in this book.
More a question of applicability rather than I forgot the term he just used.
Me too.
Than validity. The complaint wasn't that it was invalid. The complaint was that it wasn't, by other historians who don't want to use it, that it just not easy and not convenient to work with history. I mean, it just doesn't. The kinds of evidence we have in history just aren't conducive to doing mathematics with. Was basically the complaint. And he's basically saying, no, that's wrong. I mean, we actually have lots of stuff in history that mathematics is relevant to.
Yeah, and you can take it.
Like one example he gives is like different cities and where they have libraries or not, and where and we have archaeological records of lots of different cities in certain areas having libraries, and then other areas not. So we can base statistics on that. If we have a new archaeological discovery and it has the library, based on that we can say, well, it's probably part of the civilization from that time period that had all these libraries, and not from one of their neighboring civilizations. That could be wrong, but it's a probabilistic thing, and based on what we know about the distribution of libraries, that would be true.
And to those researchers who might be afraid that the use of Bayes' theorem is too arbitrary. I think that Richard, in proving history at least, especially because it's all methodology, demonstrates that I think it's true that if you don't know, you start with 50% because it's an iterative process. It's a self-correcting tool anyway.
Yes.
You know.
But a lot of times we actually do know. We have similar stuff we can compare to. And the basic thing he talks about for getting prior probabilities is figure out what reference class things are in. So this is if this is a type of something, how many of those somethings have this property generally? Then we have as a prior probability that percentage chance that the thing we're looking at will have that property. The other evidence regarding the thing we look at that could modify that, plus more or less.
Yeah, every time you look at a new piece of evidence, you adjust your probability.
But what I'm saying is you have a reference class system. Anything we're talking about is usually part of some reference class, like mythic heroes or Messiah figures from the past or something, or different holy texts. And if we're trying to claim that particular one we're looking at should have a certain property, we start with the fact that we know of all the other texts of the same reference class how many had that property. And then if there's specific evidence in the case of what we're looking at, that can make it more or less likely.
Before we continue, actually, I think there's something that really needs to go it needs to be mentioned, it's that part of the thesis of the Proving History book, especially part of it, was a demonstration that the methodologies that are currently in use in biblical studies and New Testament studies fail the Bayesian. Or there are places where they actually succeed, but for the most part, they're flawed methodologies, and he uses Bayes' theorem to demonstrate that they're flawed methodologies. And I think that's a crucial point. Is that he makes this point later on in the book in the beginning too, that one of the reasons why all of these different scholars keep coming up with all of these different pictures of some possible plausible Jesus is because there is no one methodology, because if they all had one methodology, it just makes sense that you would at least point toward something that was cohesively accepted,
So, what do you think the problem would be there, though? Because, as he points out in chapter 1, I think, or is it the introduction, that scholars, even mainstream scholars, recognize that there's quite a bit of mythical information about Jesus, not historical information, but they still cling to the idea that there's some historical kernel. Now, is that a failure to follow through with Bayesian logic, or is it something else?
I think it's. I think
in that case, it's something else. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you come to the precipice, but you don't dive into the precipice because it's like we live in a culture. We're not just islands. We're not solipsists. We live. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like if you're brought up, like for instance, I was brought up Catholic, and I don't care about religion at all now, but
because you were Catholic.
No. But I'm saying, like, could I, as an artist, could I make a piece like Piss Christ? No, I think that would be wrong. And so I think that what I'm trying to say is that we have all of these cultural ties and familial ties, which kind of not force us, but kind of like make us, program us. How about that? Condition us.
And also the academic world is a culture unto itself that has a lot of unwritten laws, subtle pressures, social things, job security, all that stuff that's dependent on having something, if you said, well, we're not studying anything, we're just playing with words and ideas and concepts, then it kind of makes your whole field of study, your whole career, kind of meaningless.
Well, it could, but I don't think they should see it that way, because I mean, right now we have scholarly study of the Iliad, we have scholarly study of Gilgamesh. It shouldn't devalue it, I think.
So what's the problem between adjusting between, okay, we're dealing with historical problems to we're not dealing with historical problems? What kind of category does that place that study in that they might resist?
Like I said, in its rightful place right next to, the Odyssey and Gilgamesh and all these other ones.
Yeah. We kind of jumped ahead. John had asked a question earlier about our general feeling about the book, just from, and I haven't read all the way through it yet. I'm only in like chapter 4 right now. But I'm actually find it nice that it's actually different than some other mythicist books I've read. I mean, I've read G.A. Wells before, I've read Doherty before, and Carrier's getting the main part of his thesis from Doherty, but the way he presents it in this book is very different so far. And the other thing I find fascinating about this book, we won't discuss at this hangout, but he talks about the background information we should have in chapters 4 and 5 about the time period and early Christianity in general. And there's just so much fascinating stuff he adds in there that a lot of other biblical scholars don't bring up.
Well, he does bring up the point that Doherty's theory is much more comprehensive, but what he did is distilled down to a minimal mythicism.
Yes.
And a minimal historicity.
Yes,
so that was his aim. Based on that, if you could show that the probabilities favored mythicism even at a minimal basis. But he does specifically say that he's not going 100% with Doherty in this book anyway.
Yeah. It's just refreshing having a different, and not reading the same thing you read from another author. I mean, it's actually new material in this book. But about the minimal theory, there's an important reason for doing that, and that's like whenever you add more conditions or details to a theory, every condition you add makes it less probable that the theory is true. So you never improve a theory by adding more conditions to it. The only time that can help is when you actually have evidence that one of the conditions is actually true. So you can't just have the condition as a postulate. You have to actually have an actual reason to think that evidence is, that what you're adding is more than 50% likely on its own. So if what you're adding is 99% likely, then it can be helpful. But still, it makes your theory 99% of what it was, and probability of being true. I don't want to spend too much time discussing the previous book, because the main person to hang out to discuss on the history of Jesus. But I wanted to read a little bit out of Proving History just to kind of get us started, because it's actually kind of important, and it kind of covers what we do in all these hangouts, with all the different books we read, and we're talking about historical method. Sometimes we get people coming in here who are Christians or apologists and stuff, and you start arguing about some of their perspectives on things that just aren't from a scholarly perspective. And so I thought I'd kind of define what scholarly historical method actually entails. And Carrier listed several axioms of the historical method. I'm not going to read his discussion of them, I'm just going to read the axioms themselves. Axiom 1. The basic principle of rational empirical history is that all conclusions must logically follow from the evidence available to all observers. Axiom 2. The correct procedure in historical argument is to seek a consensus among all qualified experts who agree with the basic principle of rational empirical history and to practice what they preach. Notice he's not saying that we as individuals should be deciding, kind of really. We have our own opinions and stuff, but the goal is to collectively form a consensus with other experts.
Yeah, but what does expertise entail? I have a general aversion to such elitism, and I'll just leave it at that.
I don't really think it's elitism. It's actually the opposite of elitism. It's the prevention of elitism. By saying scholars, need to put their own theories
Yeah, I know, but
aside
what
to
determines,
consensus.
is you have to be following a curriculum at some institution of advanced learning to actually be
Yeah.
reading
Yeah.
F.C. Bauer and all these other people.
And realize at the same time that Carrier's saying this, he's trying to challenge the consensus. But it all makes sense, though. Axiom 3. Overconfidence is fallacious. Admitting ignorance and uncertainty is not. Axiom 4. Every claim has a non-zero probability of being true or false, unless its being true or false is logically impossible. Axiom 5. Any argument relying on the inference possibly, therefore probably, is fallacious. That seems kind of silly, but we actually get a lot of supposed scholars doing that, you know. Well, maybe this happened. I'm going to think that's what probably happened.
Well, that's the entirety of the field, if you ask me.
Yeah, there's way too much of that. Axiom 6. An effective consensus of qualified experts constitutes meeting the initial burden of evidence. Axiom 7. Facts must be distinguished from theories. Axiom 8. A conclusion is only as certain as its weakest premise. I think a lot of people forget that too.
Right. That concept right there is central to the book, especially at the end.
Yeah, it is. Bayes' theorem helps to work around that problem, or work with that problem, however you want to say it, but it takes that into account. Axiom 9. The strength of any claim is always proportional to the strength of the evidence supporting it. Axiom 10. Weak claims that contradict strong claims are probably false, and not the other way around. Axiom 11. Generalizations must be supported by evidence, and that evidence must consist of more than one example, or of an example that strongly implies a general trend. And once supported, it can't be ignored. What he means by can't be ignored is some scholars will argue for what's the general case in some situations, but then later they'll ignore that and try to argue for something else in a certain situation where they haven't really defended it not being the general case. It's like they want to cherry pick what's more convenient for them at the time, and you can't do that. Axiom 12. When one of us cites a scholar, it should only be assumed we agree with what they say that is essential to the point we cite them for. And one reason Carrier includes this in here is because he cites other authors all the time, and then, well, you agreed with this other author on this thing, why don't you agree with him on this other thing kind of thing, and he gets complained about. And,
well, yeah, it's a logical fallacy.
Yeah. Or people assume, that because he cited, like Murdoch on one issue, well, he generally disagrees with her on something, but she gets things right sometimes, and he might quote her on that. People will assume, oh, then he trusts her in other things.
Just trust me, in this book, he never cites Murdoch in this book, but he does cite people like John Dominic Crossan.
Yeah. So besides his axiom, he has another 12 rules of historical method, and I'll read them also. Rule 1, obey the 12 axioms given above, and Bayes' theorem articulated in the remainder of this book. This does not mean you must use Bayes' theorem in any mathematical sense, only that any historical argument you employ must not violate Bayes' theorem. Rule 2, develop wide expertise in the period, topics, languages, and materials that you intend to blaze any trails in, or else base all your assumptions in these areas on the established and properly cited findings of those who have. Rule 3, check all claims against the evidence and scholarship, especially generalizations and assumptions. That is, don't assume that because you heard or read it somewhere, or it just seems plausible, that therefore it's likely or true. Rule 4, confirm that an argument follows from the original language of a text with as much assurance as from your preferred translation, and confirm that your preferred translation fits the original context, both textual and social-cultural. Rule 5, phrase all your claims for optimal truth value. Use all necessary qualifications. Avoid hyperbole. Do not state as fact that which is not fact, or as certain what is not certain. Always express degrees of certainty or uncertainty when appropriate. Acknowledge the difference between speculation and assertion, and concede when more research is needed. He's probably right about that.
I would agree, yeah.
I was joking. Rule 6, don't conflate weakly supported claims with strongly supported claims, or confuse theories with facts or speculations with theories. Always be explicit in all your writings as to which is which. Rule 7, address all relevant and significant evidence against what you claim, including any relevant arguments from silence against what you claim. Rule 8, take into account problems of chronological development. Everything changed over time, and documents written much later may or may not reflect earlier views or practices, regardless of what they claim. Hence, for example, any argument for influence requires evidence not just of parallels and similarities, but of the causal direction of that influence. Although this works both ways. Just because one source comes later than another does not entail that the causal direction runs the same way, as the later source can still be attesting a tradition that predates the earlier source. Rule 9. Always cite your primary evidence, or cite sources that either cite the relevant primary evidence themselves or cite further sources that collectively do. Primary evidence being the earliest surviving evidence of the chain of causation. That is, for example, a modern or medieval historian citing an ancient historian is not primary evidence if the original text of that ancient historian survives, because then that is the primary evidence. In other words, never make controversial assertions without leaving a trail of sources and evidence sufficient to confirm those assertions are true. Almost done here. Rule 10. Avoid reliance on scholarship prior to 1950. And rely as much as possible on scholarship published after 1970. Work published prior to 1950 need not be ignored, but should not be relied upon if at all possible, except perhaps for archaeology and philology. For example, observational reporting and textual criticism. Old work should be avoided altogether, or employed only when supported by later work, or your own independent verification. And I'm guilty of this sometimes, citing Couchot on some stuff, but I don't think he's been refuted ever. Rule 11. Always report what the most recent general scholarship says on a subject, or what the current leading consensus is, if either is different from your own view. Do not give the impression that a view contrary to the leading consensus is the consensus, or that a maverick view is a normal view. Rule 12. Admit when you are wrong and publish a correction or revision. Constantly seek expert criticism or refine your work in this very respect. So I kind of like those rules, so I wanted to read them here for you guys.
I have issues with them. I like the one, I'll just keep it quick. What I said about elitism and about reading old stuff, and you even just now said that sometimes you cite Couchot and F.C. Bauer and Van Manen and all these other people who have never been refuted, as far as I know.
But there's a difference between citing them regarding ideas and theories and citing them with regard to what the facts of the matter are. And I think that's part of what he means behind there. I mean, we should use the latest scholarship regarding what the facts are.
Why?
When they're right, they're right.
If they're right, they're right. Why does it have to be modern? I have a strong problem
because
with that.
Prior to 1950, we didn't really have good methodology, and there's a lot of bad scholarship before that time. That's the reason he says
sure, there is a lot of bad scholarship, but it speaks for itself. An argument will speak for itself.
There's also new evidence that comes out, different things like that, new discoveries. So, a lot of things are based on no longer current evidence.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously...
Like he says, you need to do your own evaluation or whatever,
That's my point.
So I want to just move us along because I'd like to discuss all those points, but
Exactly.
Wayne was just offering them for a quick overview. So to conclude the general portion of it, I thought that what Carrier's Axioms, the 12, and also this, is he's trying to put it on a scientific basis. A lot of this
Right.
is trying to develop a common methodology that would be acceptable to historians in the same way as they work for scientists, where when he talks about consensus, it's the same way where we have reproducible experimentation. We publish in science findings to peer-reviewed journals so that everyone can take a look at and evaluate. But the trouble is, a lot of people in this field and a lot of institutions have resistance to doing things that way because they have a vested interest in it. So that was my general feeling on the overview of it.
Regarding the methods historians have been using, prior to Carrier, and I don't really want. Historians in general have some pretty good methods they've been using. I mean, there's the argument from evidence. If there's more evidence for something, that's more likely true. And there's the argument for best explanation, when there's only several alternate explanations, and one of them is clearly more likely than the others, and it's probably the one that's right. It's true that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And all of these things fit right in with Bayes' theorem, though. If you apply Bayes' theorem, you get the same conclusion that these arguments give.
That's just simple parsimony, though. I mean, I think that the methods that have been employed prior to this proposed method was demonstrated in the previous book to be fallacious, and that was part of the thesis of the book.
He divides them into a couple of different groups. I mean, he has these overall historical methods that have been well proven among various fields, and then he has some of the criteriology that the historical scholars do, and then he shows why the criteriology doesn't match either these other general methods or Bayes' theorem in general.
And why and that criteriology is kind of a recent invention that was specifically designed for the study of of the New Testament.
Exactly, yeah. But basically the main point he goes, though, is that having all these other criteria is unnecessary because Bayes' theorem covers it all. Bayes' theorem is comprehensive in that regard.
I would agree with Bayes' theorem, and I would, leave it at that. I think that sometimes he extends beyond Bayes, but yes, I agree that it's within Bayes. Yeah. It's all within Bayes.
But even like the making arguments from silence, if something is true, this person would have mentioned it, but he's different, therefore it's probably not true. That's a valid argument, and Bayes' theorem shows why it's valid. It's an easy argument to misuse, but that doesn't mean it's not valid.
Well, it shows when it's valid and when it's not valid.
Yeah.
And there's some questions I had about Bayes in general, but I'll wait until we actually come to the examples that piqued my questioning. So I'll just leave it to that future period.
There's other stuff I made notes on about we should discuss with this book. Carrier's motivation to even write this book. And that's actually the result of a several-year project he was doing. He was not a mythicist when he started the project. He thought he was going to come out on the historicity side. He also was not especially interested in the subject matter. He had to have a bunch of people bug him to get interested in the subject matter.
And then Doherty was his Damascus Road moment.
Yeah, but basically, a bunch of people via Atheists United, but there's a bunch of donors, gave him a $20,000 grant to do this research, and to talk about the methodology with Bayes' theorem and how he applies it to this particular situation. And it was just doing that entire project that he changed his mind and came to the mythicist side of the opinion that the mythicists are right.
So I'd like to throw the floor open to anybody else that has any comments about the book in general before we start specifically going through it.
The book. I haven't expressed how I feel about the book. This is my second time reading it. I read it in its entirety when it first came out. I think Richard is generally right. There are places where I think he stretches, but I think he's generally right. And what I appreciate about the book most, though, is his methodological rigor, if I could put it that way. He promotes a method and he sticks to it for the most part.
Yep.
And because of his rigor, though, I could see how the method kind of forces people to stay honest, right? And for those people, scholars, who have grown accustomed to the old methodologies, criteriologies, who don't want to let them go, he's kind of seen as a threat. And so people kind of came at him pretty strongly when the book first came out. But I think he's generally right, and I think that the fact that people came at him so strongly and almost vitriolically, but not quite, is because he hit a nerve.
Yep.
I think that by forcing people to stay honest, he's onto something here.
Yeah. I want to mention some other things, though, about the bigger picture here. One thing about Carrier's background, he was a scholar of the history of science originally. He also has a little bit of study in philosophy, but history of science was his main field of study.
And with an
ancient Greek and Roman science and stuff. Prior to that,
with an emphasis on the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and he didn't get into like religious history until later, as kind of a consequence of studying the history of science before that. And that's also part of why he's into the Bayes theorem stuff, is because he came to it from a scientific angle. The other thing I want to mention, though, just on the big picture of Bayes theorem and stuff, is it's not just Carrier making waves. There's actually elsewhere in the world in other fields, other waves happening with Bayes theorem. A bunch of scientific journals have started to no longer accept articles based on p-value testing, which is an alternative to Bayes that a lot of alternative statistical method. It's actually the more conventional method, but it's too flawed. Basically, if something has a more than 95% chance of being right and less than 5% chance of being wrong with the statistics, then they'll say it meets the right p-value to publish it. And a lot of publishers are no longer following that. It just doesn't work. And the problem is that means 1 in 20 articles is probably false if you do that. And with other compounding factors, it gets even worse because we tend to not publish things where experiments are falsified.
And if all these things are falsified at once, it's like where's the scholarly field going to go?
So basically, some of those same journals now are requiring their submitters to use Bayes theorem now, and to consider the prior probabilities of their theories being true based on the background knowledge we have. Prior to talking about the evidence that they're talking about in their thesis. I mean, before you even get to your thesis, what is the prior probability that your idea is going to be correct? And they're being forced to address that now by a lot of these journals, which is a very good thing. So basically, my point in that is that there's a big wave with Bayes theorem coming on, not just in biblical studies, but I mean just all across the board in various fields. They're starting to realize how useful it is. Anybody else still here?
Yeah, I think that the publication of Carrier's book, and also the publication of, there's a woman named, what's her name? Shane something. She wrote the book called The Theory That Would Not Die.
Yes.
And then there have been, and Nathan Silver.
Yeah, Nate Silver, yeah.
Nate Silver has published. So there's been a lot of popular works and scholarly works, specifically addressing the utility of Bayes' theorem in just just regular life cultural things.
Yeah.
Not just mathematical applications.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask, but I think we already lost Robert. I was hoping he'd stay with us. Coming into it, before we read this book, how many of us, where do we lie on the spectrum between believing in historicity or believing in mythicism? I mean, are we all mythicists now in this discussion?
I think that it's, yeah, I would probably call myself a mythicist. I think that it's more likely that it's all mythical, yeah. But it wasn't Carrier that convinced me, it was Doherty.
Same here. I actually got interested in it after reading G.A. Wells, but it was Doherty that pushed me to actually, okay, yeah, you're right.
So I think the perfect combination of books would be Carrier's books and Doherty's big book.
Yeah.
I think, mostly because I think that Doherty has a higher acumen in just biblical knowledge.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Even though Carrier brings up lots of fascinating stuff, but so does Doherty, so yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the best defense of historicity book that you know of so far?
Here's the thing I'm going to say. Carrier is claiming that this book on the historicity of Jesus is the best defense of both historicity and mythicism. He's attempting to present what to his mind is the best defense of historicity and then compare it to the best defense of mythicism.
Right, and I think he's right, but it's not his place to kind of call that. Somebody else has to stand outside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I just want to say that's part of the scope of this book, though, is to try to make the best case.
But I'd like to address Richard's question, if I may, though. Richard? Richard, are you there? Did he leave?
I think he's still here. Answer
Hello?
the question.
Oh, hello? Yes.
Oh, yeah, you asked what the book that probably presents the historicist case the best.
That was not me. That was someone else.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry.
This
It's
was
all right.
this was David asked that question me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We both have blue bodies. Sorry
Okay,
to get
yeah.
confused.
Have you read any books that purport to be historicist books? Because one of the issues that I have with calling someone a historicist is, in order to qualify for that term, I think some kind of a monograph or extensive work must have been written specifically on historicity. In other words, you can't just accept Jesus as historical to be a historicist. Like John Dominic Crossan assumes that Jesus' historicity is a given, but that doesn't make him a historicist. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so with that thought in mind, I think that probably, to my reading, I've read many of the books that purport to be historicist books. And probably the only even-handed one in my experience, I probably think of a couple of other ones, but there's two of them that I would recommend as decently written and even-handed. One of them being Paul Eddy and Greg Boyd wrote two of them. One of them is a pop version of a bigger volume, and I don't know which is which, but you can research that. One of them is called Jesus Lord or Legend, and I think that's the big one. And then Robert Van Voorst wrote a book called Jesus Outside the New Testament, and that's also a fairly decent book, even though it's got many problems of its own. But at least it's not like the worst books you can read on this are Bart Ehrman's book, which is just horrible, or Maurice Casey's book, which is just even worse than Bart Ehrman's because it's just worse. But I'll leave it at that.
Did anybody else have anything to add?
Did that answer your question, David?
Yes, I will look into those authors.
Okay, cool.
So, does anybody else have any observations about the books in general before we move on? Wayne?
I'm ready to move on.
Are you? Are you sure?
Yeah.
So what's going on? Are we moving on?
I thought we were. I thought John was going to take us forward.
All right. We agreed that we'd start with the preface, so is there anything in the preface that anybody wanted to comment on? It's very short.
No, I think I've already mentioned what I wanted to from the preface in our talk up to this point, just kind of smuggling things into the earlier discussion.
Yeah, it was just basically a discussion of how he came to write the book, where he got the support, acknowledgments, that kind of stuff. So, chapter 1, I guess, is entitled "The Problem." So go ahead and move on.
But it is where he admits to being paid to write this book, and then tries to defend himself as not having any biases on the matter.
I don't know. That was never an issue for me. That if somebody wants to do a Patreon or a GoFundMe and people will pay him money, then and he delivered. You know, he did what he got. I think that he probably could have got another book out of on the Historicity of Jesus. I mean, it's pretty packed full of information.
I don't know, like where else he could go. This one would need to be responded to first before he could even consider writing another one, because there's no point. He's already said it, you know.
Well, there's a lot of things where he includes every single detail, and sometimes he even comments on that, like later in the book. It's like, I'm going to go ahead and just beat this horse to death.
Yeah. And that's why it's, you know, how many pages? It's 800 and some pages.
Yeah, it's I
700.
never count. Yeah, I never counted without the indexes and stuff, but probably well over 600 pages of actual text, I guess.
Yeah, Doherty's book is like 800. This is a little shorter, at around 700.
So the first chapter opens with a little bit of his background about, you know, what he had stated just briefly in the preface, that how he came to consider mythicism after previously not. And I can honestly say that that's a lot similar to my situation, because I had just assumed, like everybody else, that Jesus existed, you know, that there was no doubt about it, you know. And that was not exactly, I wasn't really partial or had any kind of easy acceptance of it. I had to read quite a bit before I at least came to the minimal conclusion that mythicism, if you want to use that term, was worth looking at, that, you know, not necessarily true, but not fringe, not something to be tossed aside, but to be seriously considered.
Well, it's at least as plausible as any other, you know, New Testament theory.
Right, and Carrier's aim of this book is to show that it's actually more plausible.
Yeah, exactly.
So he goes through bringing it up to date after discussing some of the older Illuminati of the past. I think just how he got up to the current situation, and that's in section 2 of the first chapter, which is the debate today. So anything up until this point? Any questions or comments?
Yeah, could you give a synopsis of the Doherty thesis? Because I've never read that book.
Jesus started off as a celestial, mythic, soteriological being, not unlike those of the mystery religions, and much like the devotees of other mystery religions, such as those of Isis and Mithras and other ones, they adopted going through the process of syncretism, moving from the old world, let's say, to the new Hellenic setting for the mystery religion, there are parallels between Christianity and the history of those other cults.
And the other mythicisms also basically present the same case. What Doherty did that impressed Carrier specifically was he did an exhaustive study of the actual evidence, the earliest Christian literature, for instance, the 7 authentic, quote-unquote, letters of Paul, other Hebrews and Revelation, other books of the New Testament, non-canonical books that can be dated early. And the evidence, if you do not interpret with a bias of automatically assuming the gospel story, that Doherty did a very good job of showing that all this literature can be interpreted from a mythicist point of view, where none of them are actually documenting any actual historical Jesus
And
as a person that lived.
And therefore it can explain the origins of Christianity without recourse to a historical figure.
And the reason to do that is not because we have an aversion to having a historical figure there, but just because we believe that's a better explanation. It makes more sense of the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, more sense of the relationship between Christianity and other pagan cults, and just what's going on in that time period.
Yeah, he's not saying start with a bias against historicity. It's starting with no biases, and where does the actual evidence speak?
Yeah.
And where does it take you? Because hitherto, scholarship has automatically assumed an historical Jesus and has seen all the earliest writing, including Paul, through the lens of the gospel writing, which Doherty and Carrier believe Paul was the earliest writings, first century, within 30 years of well, let's just say, can't say when Jesus died, obviously, but circa around the time of the first Jewish war, that if you look at that data as coming first without the Gospels, which are even by mainstream scholarship assumed to be later, that removes a lot of blinkers and a lot of interpretation that's illegitimate because it was being forced on the data from a different perspective or a later perspective.
Yeah.
I think that covers it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want me to read too much from other books besides the book we're actually doing from the Hangout, but to answer David's question about Doherty's thesis, we potentially could read Doherty's 12 pieces of the Jesus puzzle, which is like a page and a half in the beginning of his book. And I think it's worth reading if you want to understand what his thesis is in Doherty's own words.
Well, that stuff's available online, and if you really needed to know it, you could have looked it up.
Okay, we can do that too. It's up to you guys.
Yeah, because we should try to stick to the book, and it's unfortunate that some of us have probably been more widely read in this topic, but any kind of questions like that could be dealt with outside the Hangout, let's say.
Yeah, but it relates to chapter 3 of Carrier's book, which we're supposed to cover this Hangout.
That's true. But just like he will put that stuff in footnotes, and we should probably do the same.
Okay.
Otherwise, we'll be talking about this till next Christmas. We'll probably see the Price-Ehrman debate before we're finished this book.
I'm already halfway through my notes and why I wanted to discuss this Hangout.
Oh, are you saying that you're just basically going through your notes that you wanted to actually cover? Because if that's exactly the case, then I have no problem with that.
I'm joking.
Since you prepared. Well, if you did the work, I wouldn't say, I'm going to cut you off. If you wanted to go ahead and present that stuff, that's fine.
No, it's secondary. We'll just get a link.
Okay. Okay, then the second section of Chapter 1 is the current debate. He goes basically into the situation in scholarship, how mythicism is currently viewed, how prevalent historicist position is, And he also mentions Van Voorst's book, Jesus Outside the New Testament there. Spends some time on that too, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Almost the entire section of section 2 was discussing that. So
Yeah, he
I was
breaks
just
down. He breaks down where all of Van Voorst's errors.
right. Well, is there anything that you want to specifically point out, Leon, before we move on, that might be significant about his treatment of Van Voorst?
He's pretty even-handed with it. I think he demonstrates where it's fallacious, and I'm not really looking at anything right now, but if I recall, he demonstrates the different places where it's fallacious, and he also he's fair to Van Voorst. He's not like yeah, he doesn't have nice things to say about necessarily Ehrman, but Van Voorst he's cool with. He appreciates that Van Voorst tried to put together a historicist case that wasn't just vitriolic and rabid,
Yeah, and I think the whole point about bringing him up and what his treatment was is that I think he had a message, and that was that one of the 12 axioms that Wayne had brought up is that just because you find that something is not invalid doesn't mean it's automatically valid. I don't know if I'm putting it that correctly. Did I get that right, Wayne?
I don't have the list in front of me anymore, but yeah, just because you can't disprove something, that
doesn't mean that some default position stands proven.
Yeah.
Right, or the opposite automatically is true, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the reasons why he brought up Van Voorst anyway, was to at least give a concrete example of that particular axiom in practice, and to show in some detail.
I think you're just taking one of the more favorable examples of how bad historical Jesus scholarship has been.
And incidentally, Carrier's use of Bayes' theorem demonstrating that the criteriology of the past is fallacious. He's not alone in this. He's actually basing this on his reading and research of Hector Avalos and what's his name? Philip Davies, is it? There's another one. There are a couple of other ones. Thomas Thompson. Yeah, there are a few.
The Mythic Christ or whatever, Mythic Messiah.
Yeah.
Is that book?
Even some of the newer guys like I forget, a friend of Daniel's. I forget his name right now.
McGrath?
No, gosh, no.
Mark Goodacre?
No. No, never mind. Just continue. I just forgot the dude's name.
Right. Well, at the end of section 7 is just a couple sentences. This is where he's talking about where he first kind of mentions the minimal theory of historicity versus minimal theory of mythicism. So I'll just let him speak. It's necessary to test a minimal theory of historicity, such that, this is page 7, such that if even that theory isn't true, then none are, against a minimal theory of myth, such that if that theory isn't true, then no other is likely to be. And this test must be logically valid and give the best possible opportunity to either theory before whatever conclusion we reach can be considered fair. And he shows a lot of examples of this in the coming area where he, when he's assigning probabilities to either of the evidence to either argument, he'll often argue what's the Latin term? Where
a fortiori.
Yeah, a fortiori. Very good, thank you. Where he's actually giving a little bit more probability, weight to the evidence for historicity and still finding it wanting in a lot of cases. So when we go to some of the specific examples, we can evaluate that. Because there's a couple times, I think, when Leon was discussing his overall impression of the book that there was a couple things where I thought that he might have been a little bit slipping in his rigorous methodology, but we'll go over that when we actually
Okay, no,
encounter it.
I welcome those because
We could discuss.
I have issues with a few things too, so it's all good.
It wasn't much, so overall, I thought he did a very good job, and
Yeah.
I think we all agree on that anyway so far. Those who are participating.
Yeah, I think whatever issues I have are kind of minutia that don't really take away from the thesis, because even if the thesis doesn't need that to be so.
Okay, the next section is entitled Section 3, Myth versus History, and this is a little bit of historical background on the debate historically between mythicists and historicists over, not too much detail, but kind of a general overlook of it. It's a very short section. He points out that there's like a zillion historical theories of Jesus and quite a few mythicist theories as well. So the question becomes, how do you weigh these theories as to which has a more higher probability? And that's where he brings in one of his axioms about the more complex a theory has to be, the less likely it is to be true, that Wayne discussed earlier and discussed rather well.
Yeah. One thing I will mention here, and just kind of as a note here, this method of taking a minimal historicist theory and a minimal mythicist theory is a method that works because we kind of got lucky. I mean, it's not mathematically necessary that this would be the right method to use. The situation basically is that for minimal history, the minimal history view subsumes pretty much all the different historical views. So it just takes kind of what they have in common, the basic core bit of them. And so if what's in common is not likely, then none of the individual theories could be likely. On the mythicist side, that's not what he's doing.
Right. I was going to say, yeah.
He's not taking a mythicist theory that subsumes all the others. It's actually, some of these mythicist theories are quite different. But he says that some of these other mythicist theories are just so unlikely that by themselves, that Doherty's theory is really the only one worth comparing to the historicist theory.
Right, and there's an issue there.
In possibility, had we had 2 or 3 good mythicist theories that are all different, we may have to do a 4 or 5-way comparison here, not just a 2-way comparison.
I agree with that. I think that, but I happen to agree with him that the Doherty one is the only one that's really worth anything. But I don't. Yeah, but I think there's a little bit of a logical something there that. Yeah, I don't think there's parity there, like you just pointed out.
It doesn't need. He's taking the most likely, what's most likely if historicity is true versus what's most likely if mythicism's true, and comparing those. And those happen to be these minimal theories.
Right.
And I think as an exercise to accomplish that goal, I think it works well. It's also, I think, logically possible that the best theory has not been actually formulated yet.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Right.
So it's not necessarily one of these others, it's a false dichotomy.
Right.
Right, so what we have to work with is just a tool. Is this like, almost a thought experiment in a way?
Yeah.
Does he mention any other mythicist theorists besides the Doherty or the Atwill thesis?
Mythicist?
Yeah, besides Atwill or and Doherty, those are.
No, only in passing and only kind of cryptically.
It's not really the subject of this book because his subject is minimal mythicism, so he really can avoid any kind of particular theory. It's just that he thinks that Doherty has a very good theory, and he's not even arguing the full Doherty theory. He's only arguing a minimal.
A minimal version of it, yeah.
Yeah. So he also brings up something at the very end of Section 3, which is that he's talking about other evidence that might be enough to to influence probability. Because I think Wayne mentioned earlier, when he's talking, he says, what's known to you, what's known to him, the evidence that he's aware of, and he's weighing that evidence to put these theories against one another. But that doesn't exclude that other evidence that, say, like somebody dug up a cache of new documents, say that from the 1st century, and gave us a clear picture of the evolution of Christian writings, for instance. That's different, I think, from what he's talking about, don't you think? That it's not a question of evidence per se, it's a question of the evidence you have to work with in order to arrive at a valid conclusion.
You mean rather than some cleverly devised textual analysis?
Yes.
Right, somebody could rework evidence, and say, okay, if you interpret it this way, you're ignoring that as if you're ignoring evidence, but, I don't think it's the same thing. I think there's different classes of evidence.
Basically, what he was saying at the end of this paragraph is, he's picking Doherty's version of mythicism as the one he's going to use, a minimal version of, because he doesn't think any other mythicist theory is really probable. But if somebody else can give a bit more evidence for one of these other mythicist theories, he'd reconsider it. That's what he's basically saying there.
I don't really want to go much later than 10 o'clock my time. Is it okay if we end it here? Or you guys could go on without me.
We can end it here. I was thinking we'd go 2 hours. I know Reuven said 3, which is too long. But 90 minutes is also fine with me, and we're almost coming up on 90 minutes.
I could probably go till 2 hours then. That's no problem. Yeah, so if you want to go till another half hour is fine.
Okay.
Okay, anything else on section 3? Alrighty, no comments. Okay, section 4 is mythicists versus historicists, and he brings up the interesting example of King Arthur. Now, for most of history, modern history, of critical history and literature, King Arthur's been considered basically a mythical person. I think that's most of the theories that have come out have just assumed that he's some kind of, in a way, a figurehead, a representation, a symbol of a certain cultural period, and also the expectations of the people that lived during that time. And then he kind of compares Jesus in the same way to that. And then, of course, comes up the question, why is Jesus the exception, even in secular historical circles that are supposedly not tied to religious institutions? But I read an interesting book years ago which argued that there actually was a historical Arthur that could be determined from the literature, and he made a pretty good case for it.
At least that, there could be a valid historicist case made, minimal historicism, in other words, But I'm not that hip on King Arthur stuff.
Yeah, neither am I.
I just mentioned it in passing because, I just went up before I assumed the book. Again, I assumed that King Arthur was just a legend, not particularly had to have been based on anybody. But he kind of showed where there was a guy that was in actually multiple places in the literature, but he was called Arthur in the more legendary stuff, but he actually could, based on deeds, kind of, if you kind of, did the dating, because a lot of it depends on dating, and it kind of overlapped the person that was in historical records by a different name. So if you could find enough correlations between this historical person,
but at that point it becomes an inspiration, not necessarily a historicization or whatever.
Well, that means that there was a historical person that did certain deeds that became legendary or magnified. But the difference is that even in the case of Jesus, there's no other outside historical information that we could pinpoint and say, this is actually referring to the same Jesus of Nazareth. Even though we might not have recognized it at first, it's no matter how you look at any of the literature, it's just not there.
I don't know much about the Arthurian legends, but believe it or not, I've been reading a little bit about Marco Polo, and it turns out that Marco Polo is a myth.
Yeah, I was reading that, something like that. Probably wasn't reading the same thing, but just in general discussion that was almost wholly legendary.
It's almost completely legendary. It's just legends that came with the silk trade. But
yeah,
I won't derail the discussion. But yeah, I think it's kind of related to like the whole Arthurian kind of thing.
Yeah. I want to jump in here though. I think mainly what Carrier's trying to get at here though is the Jesus myth theory is not on the face of it, obviously crazy. I mean, we have instances of other people who didn't really exist, and mainstream scholarship says that in King Arthur's case, he didn't really exist, but he became historicized.
Okay,
And other examples can be brought forth too. I mean, so it's not crazy that the same thing could have happened with Jesus, that he was originally a myth and then became historicized. The opposite is not crazy either. We also have examples, of historical figures who lots of mythology is developed around. I mean, and Carrier gives examples of both in here. And it's basically his point of that is neither of these views should be discarded out of hand.
Right, and so if we can soberly determine that this is the case, that it's not crazy, why are mythicists the butt of so much anger and vitriol?
Something in history that you see a lot is when a new idea comes up, the people who disagree with it or have some really entrenched view that's threatened by it are very nasty towards the people that come up with these views, but they can't help being affected by the effects that has, and it's mostly because, I think, and especially now it's true, is the popularization of certain ideas that kind of feed back into the mainstream to make them question some of the things, but it takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. Paradigm shifts take a while. But I can even see, like, I talk a lot with Daniel Galato offline here and there, just because he misses us. And
tell him I said hi.
Yeah, and you could tell that there's a lot of re-questioning, and there's a lot of young people coming into this field that have been exposed to radical ideas, and even though they consider them fringe themselves, they can't no longer maintain the certitude of their more ancient fossilized mentors in the field, and it gradually chips away at the older ideas, and eventually, mythicism might not be persecuted, may not be still considered, a field of study that they'll have in universities, but you won't get the same type of attacks because there won't be anything to attack if you agree, for the most part, with these people and their ideas. So it just seems to be like there is a slow glacial paradigm shift in motion if you have connections with people that are in academia, I think.
But I think the other point that Carrier's trying to put here is that mainstream historical scholarship has no aversion to the talk about King Arthur being mythical. In fact, that's probably the majority view. It's probably the people who want to historicize Arthur are probably the ones who are arguing against the grain. But yet in the historical Jesus studies, they think it's crazy to argue that there was no historical Jesus.
Moses is a good example of what John's talking about, though.
Yes, I was about to bring that up.
Yeah, because you can if you want to go on.
No, I was just going to mention that Moses is, when Wayne was talking, Moses would have been a very good example to bring up because the scholarship is that he is mythical, and I mean, he just several decades ago that would have been a crazy thing to speak about.
Yeah, and it's a consensus that only seems to get growing lately.
That's another example that Carrier gives. Yeah. Carrier also gives an example of the prophet Daniel coming right up, Scholarship has since realized that Daniel is a forgery, and Daniel probably never existed.
He also brings up cargo cults, which I think is a fascinating kind of study. I wish I had more time to actually look into all the sociology of cargo cults. But one thing that strikes me about cargo cults, and I don't want to get too off topic, is it seems that even though those people first met, say, American flyers on these isolated islands and were impressed by their technology, thinking it was magical, and kind of made gods out of some of them, they're not sure exactly if there was any individual. But even though now that these people have iPods, TV, they wear Western clothing, there's constant trade, they still cling to that initial religion that came from the initial contact, which seems to happen a lot. It's that initial contact that's the most significant.
It's like a craving for purity or something. It's weird.
Yeah, and even though they should then, once they were familiar and became familiar with what the Americans were actually doing, how their technology worked, and it wasn't magical, you would think that would have been the end of the religions, but it wasn't.
So I think we should go to the end of this chapter and then resume with chapter 2 next hangout.
Religion's a hell of a drug, to quote Rick James.
Okay, section 5 is just a quick summary of what he intends to do with the book. I think we covered that, right?
Yeah.
Unless anybody has anything specific.
What page section 5 is on? Okay, you're ahead of me. I was looking at page 11, the very middle. He talks about why the mythicist case looks bad, and it's because there's been a lot of bad mythicist scholars. I mean, a lot of this book, he's not just arguing against historicists, he's telling the mythicists to get their act together.
That's a good thing.
Right, because he wants a methodology that everybody can agree on and that's workable.
Yeah, but there's a lot of mythicist books that bring up purported facts that aren't a scholarly consensus that the facts are even true, and then they're using those facts to prove their point.
Well,
that doesn't really work.
He's gracious enough to not mention anyone by name, though.
Yeah.
When he means really bad mythicists, we all can offer names of people that he means by that. But
there's not just one. No, there's many. I mean, freaking Gandhi.
I say nutted.
Yeah.
I say nutted.
That guy, that Quixie guy.
Yeah.
I say nutted.
Anyway, he ends that section on, basically there's a lot of historicists think that work has been done, that they don't need to, there's areas that are been wholly settled, and they haven't been. There's still a lot of open debate that's possible, and a lot of what they consider is already, arguments that are done and over. Anyway, section 5 talks about the aim of the book, which I didn't have anything on that. Did you guys? Section.
I think I covered that earlier, what I had to say about that.
Yeah, section 6, he's going through the rest of the book, what each chapter and section entails. I don't think we need to cover that.
Yeah, because that'll be self-evident as we go.
Yeah. Now the big one for the early chapter is applying Bayes' theorem.
The thing to remember, I'd like to, if I may, I actually come from an engineering background, and I suspect that Wayne probably does too. Do you, Wayne?
I was a physics major in college before I left.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, I was chemical engineering. But the thing to remember about Bayes is to not be scared of mathematics. What happens is a lot of people who are in the humanities or in the liberal arts, as soon as they see an equation, their brain kind of gets a block on it, and that's unfortunate because all that we really need to remember about Bayes it's that it's a ratio, a ratio of a previous probability with weighed evidence, which gives you a new probability, which you could re-input into the formula. That's all it is.
Yeah. Usually, if somebody explains what the conclusions are without math, then it's no problem for me, Because then I could go back and look and see, okay, that's what that means. But I just can't look at the math and know what it means.
But the thing is it has to make logical sense to you, though.
Right, yeah, and I really like cosmology and stuff like that, so when I'm reading a lot of that stuff, I just skip over the math to the part where he explains what conclusions can be drawn from the math. So I kind of give them a benefit of the doubt that they're doing their calculations correctly.
In the side chat, I put a link to a couple of YouTube videos by Julia Galeff. She's someone I discovered a few months ago. It has a bunch of interesting videos talking about rational thinking. But she has one on Bayesian, on how to use Bayes' theorem, and another one on meta-updating, which has to do with changing your opinion because people you respect, don't agree with you, and then you actually factor that into your own thinking. You should listen to her video about that, explaining how that works.
I agree with you.
Yeah, actually, that's the food for thought right there.
But the overall conclusion is that, we're not dealing with certainty. There's no right or wrong, it's all probability. And that's the best that can be done.
Yeah.
Because evidence is fragmentary. The further back in time you go, the less evidence you have.
That's actually not necessarily true, by the way. The further back you go, less evidence you have. It's possible to have less evidence from intermediate time periods than from older time periods. It just depends on what's going on at the time that lead things to be preserved or not.
But in this instance, it's definitely true that there's a lack of documentation that early.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of accident involved in history. So in Section 8, Elements and Axioms, would have been a good place to put all that stuff that Wayne read, instead of just referring to his previous book, I guess. Cha-ching.
Yep.
Now, what I would like to know is exactly what he's changed, idea-wise. It would have been nice to have a summary of, because he really doesn't even in the book say much about what, I used to think this, but now I think this. It'd be nice to know what he had thought of in Not the Impossible Faith, for instance, that he no longer accepts.
That would have to ask him later if we get him in the Hangout.
Yeah, mark that down as a question for Dr. Carrier.
Cool.
Okay, well I guess I'm done with chapter 1.
Yeah.
You guys? Okay.
I guess, if we're so close to chapter endings, we should just kind of end it now.
Just any kind of final thoughts about what we've covered so far?
Let me think for a second. I probably don't have any final thoughts, but let me look at my notes again. No, that's pretty much what I wanted to discuss, actually. So.
Yeah, I didn't have anything to add. Anybody else have anything to add?
And even the next two chapters, they can go pretty fast. Chapter 2, minimal historicity, is I only took 5 lines worth of notes on it.
That's
yeah,
cool.
it's the interplay between the two that is probably take up most of the time of the next Hangout.
Yeah. I think that assigning 3 chapters it was a little bit ambitious. We should probably just play it week by week, but.
Yeah, but I think the subject matter in Chapter 4 changes so much. We should just plan to do Chapter 2 and 3 next time, which is just what is minimal historicity, what is minimal mythicism as theories.
Right, because that's just that's central to the whole thing. It will help people when David asks a question about what's the good case for historicity.
Yeah, and maybe even next Hangout we may have extra time so I could read that excerpt from Doherty.
Well, I knew we wouldn't cover all 3 chapters, but I thought giving that as a goal would at least give everybody a good overview of even the beginning of the book, because
Yeah,
a lot of it
yeah.
is contingent on what's covered in 2 and 3. So if you haven't read that, it kind of makes chapter 1 a little bit more mysterious. More mysterious.
Yeah, it's a good running start.
But I felt good about actually just covering that, even though we didn't go over it in the Hangout, so that's fine. So, anything else before we sign off?
Thank you, Reuven, for coming back. Thanks for reinstituting the second season of these Hangouts.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm glad we started with this book.
Tune in next time to WPLJ.
Starting with Chapter 2 of On Historicity of Jesus by Dr. Richard Carrier.
Good night,
Somebody needs to
everyone.
wake Reuven up.